Welcome back. In our previous class, we went over constitutional war powers. Today, we're going to continue focusing on constitutional state militias. Moving on to clauses 15 and 16 of the Constitution, we read that the Congress shall have power to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions, to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. Here again we see how Congress, not the President, is given the power to call up state militias, and even then, the use of that power is restricted to only three specific circumstances: to execute the Constitution and other federal laws, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. Now, let us suppose for a moment that the United States was taken by surprise, and we were invaded by the standing army of a foreign power that's intent on conquering or overthrowing the United States. Now suppose in that same scenario we didn't already have federal armies that could repel the invasion. Should this happen, the framers wisely empowered Congress to call forth the militia of each state. They intended state militias to be our first line of defense to repel invasions. For these reasons, as in our potential scenario, the militia is supposed to be trained on a regular basis. In Clause 16, Congress is given the power to organize, arm, and discipline the militia. The states reserve the right to appoint the officers and execute the training according to the discipline or standards prescribed by Congress. Federal training of the state militias is necessary for uniformity of arms and consistency in the battlefield. During the debates in the Convention of the State of Pennsylvania on the adoption of the federal Constitution in 1787, James Wilson, who was the only framer at the Constitutional Convention to be appointed to the Pennsylvania State Ratifying Convention, said, "It is said that Congress should not possess the power of calling out the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions, nor the President have the command of them when called out for such purposes. I believe any gentleman who possesses military experience will inform you that men without a uniformity of arms, accoutrements, and discipline are no more than a mob in a camp, that, in the field, instead of assisting, they interfere with one another. If a soldier drops his musket and his companion, unfurnished with one, takes it up, it is of no service, because his cartridge do not fit it. By means of this system, a uniformity of arms and discipline will prevail throughout the United States. The militia formed under this system and trained by the several states will be such a bulwark of internal strength as to prevent the attacks of foreign enemies." Although Congress has some constitutional power over the militia is primarily in the hands of the states, except when called forth by Congress to address one or more of the three criteria specifically outlined in Clause 15. All this raises the question, what or who constitutes the militia? If you ask the average person on the street, what is the militia, they'll probably say that militias are some militant anti-government groups or domestic terrorists planning to overthrow the government and cause trouble. That is not what a militia is. A true constitutional militia is under the jurisdiction of Congress and the state in which it resides. Historically, the militia was authorized by its respective state government and received training from the state and federal government. Another answer you may often hear in response to the question of what is the militia is that the National Guard is the militia. While many may regard the National Guard as being the organized militia of each state, this too is not a constitutional militia. To answer the question of what is or qualifies as a constitutional militia, we turn to the Second Amendment. It reads, "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Whereas most gun rights activists and defenders of the Second Amendment tend to focus on the second half about the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, we sometimes miss the crucial first half, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. Did you catch that? The framers considered the militia to be necessary to the security of a free state. In other words, if you wish to remain free and to live in a free state, then you need a militia. The right to keep and bear arms is indeed for every U.S. citizen because every person should serve in his state's regulated militia, at least when he is old enough to meet the age requirements as determined by each state. And as we covered earlier, the militia is regulated by the states primarily and by Congress. And as far as federal gun control laws are concerned, absolutely nothing in Article 1, Section 8, or anywhere else in the Constitution grants Congress, the President, or the courts the power to pass such laws, executive orders, or court opinions restricting or prohibiting U.S. citizens from their natural right of self-defense. Historically, the militia consisted of all able-bodied men, which, and depending on the state one lived in, ranged in ages from 16, 17, or 18 to 45, or even 65. Basically, anyone who could bear arms of a certain age was considered part of the state's militia, so every person ought to be armed and trained in the use of his or her firearm. Forgotten founding father Tench Coxe, writing under the name A Pennsylvanian, in the February 20, 1788 issue of the Pennsylvania Gazette newspaper, explained regarding the definition of the militia, "Who are the militia? Are they not ourselves? Is it feared, then, that we shall turn our arms each man against his own bosom? Congress have no power to disarm the militia. Their swords and every other terrible implement of the soldier are the birthright of an American. The unlimited power of the sword is not in the hands of either the federal or state governments, but where I trust in God, it will ever remain in the hands of the people." In other words, we the people are the militia. The power comes not from the federal or state governments, but from us. We are the guardians of liberty against tyranny. For another excellent historical definition and significance of a militia, I recommend the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which was written primarily by George Mason and adopted by the Virginia Constitutional Convention on June 12 of 1776. Section 13 of the Virginia Declaration of Rights reads that a well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people trained to arms is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free state, that standing armies in time of peace should be avoided as dangerous to liberty, and that in all cases the military should be under strict subordination to and governed by the civil power. I love this passage. It virtually sums up everything that we're talking about in this class regarding militias and standing armies. Here we see that a well-regulated militia is clearly defined as being composed of the body of the people. Over a decade later, on June 16, 1788, during the Virginia Ratifying Convention, Mason said, "I ask, who are the militia? They consist now of the whole people except a few public officers." Officers refers to those serving in the regular federal army or navy in the armed forces of the United States. The militia consists of all able-bodied persons who are between certain ages and who are not already members of the armed forces of the United States. If you're, say, 18 years old and not already in the Army, Navy, Marines, Coast Guard, Air Force, or Space Force, then you're considered part of the militia, and as such are crucial to the security of a free state. And as part of your state's militia, we hope you choose to exercise your right to keep and bear arms. How effective would a constitutional militia be at protecting a single state, or these United States, as a whole? Let's answer this by comparing the National Guard of a state to a true constitutional state militia. First, What is the National Guard? It consists of only those who choose to volunteer or enlist. Constitutional state militias, however, historically included every able-bodied person of a certain age. And by able-bodied, we mean that if someone was deemed to not have the physical capacity to participate, they would be given a waiver. Otherwise, it was your duty to serve. If you didn't serve and show up to your training and activities, you could be fined. Today, it is estimated we have just over 300,000 soldiers in the National Guard. In South Carolina, the 23rd largest state, there are about 3 million people between the ages of 18 and 60 years old. If half of those 3 million people are able-bodied men, that would give us a state militia of approximately 1,500,000 people. That's 5 times more than those currently volunteering in the National Guard. In California, the largest state, there are about 20 million people between the ages of 18 and 60. If half of those 20 million people are able-bodied men, California would have a constitutional state militia of 10 million people, which is more than 30 times the number of current National Guard members. Constitutional state militias can easily outnumber the current National Guard. In fact, constitutional state militias could easily serve as a bulwark or check against a potential tyrannical standing army of the federal government, seeing as federal armies seldom exceed a fraction of the population in size. James Madison made this very point in the Federalist No. 46, in which he wrote, "Let a regular army fully equal to the resources of the country be formed, and let it be entirely at the devotion of the federal government. Still, it would not be going too far to say that the state governments, with the people on their side, would be able to repel the danger. The highest number to which, according to the best computation, a standing army can be carried in any country does not exceed 1/100th part of the whole number of souls, or 1/25th part of the number able to bear arms. This proportion would not yield in the United States an army of more than 25 or 30,000 men. To these would be opposed a militia amounting to near 500,000 of citizens with arms in their hands, officered by men chosen from among themselves, fighting for their common liberties, and united and conducted by governments possessing their affections and confidence. It may well be doubted whether a militia, thus circumstanced, could ever be conquered by such a proportion of regular troops." Those who are best acquainted with the last successful resistance of this country against the British arms will be most inclined to deny the possibility of it. Besides the advantage of being armed, which the Americans possess over the people of almost every other nation, the existence of subordinate governments, to which the people are attached, and by which the militia officers are appointed, forms a barrier against the enterprises of ambition more insurmountable than any which a simple government of any form can admit of. Another major difference between the National Guard and constitutional state militias is where arms are stored. When a volunteer serves on duty in the National Guard and returns home, where do the arms go? They are stored by the government in armories. The federal government owns and therefore keeps custody of those weapons, whereas in the constitutional state militias, you are required to store your weapons in your home, and you are to be ready to go at a moment's notice. The weaponry for constitutional state militias is ultimately controlled by we the people. For our final comparison, let's look at where servicemen in the National Guard and those in constitutional state militias can be deployed. Which of these two can be deployed abroad? Recall Clause 15. It said that Congress has the power to call forth the militia for 3 purposes: to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. Which one of these purposes has to do with being deployed to a country in Europe, the Middle East, or Asia? The answer is none of them. Constitutional state militias cannot be called forth into service abroad. For that purpose, Congress would have to raise an army and ideally declare war. Currently, we are deploying our National Guard forces abroad to overseas military conflicts, which would be unconstitutional if the National Guard were constitutional state militias, but they aren't. The National Guard is a state-based military, which according to Title 10 U.S. Code Section 12406, the President may call into federal service members and units of the National Guard of any state in such numbers as he considers necessary to repel the invasion, suppress the rebellion, or execute those laws. Although similar, the National Guard is not a constitutional state militia. Officially, the National Guard is the primary combat reserve of the Army and Air Force, according to the National Guard's website. It is state-based, federally funded, and part of the U.S. military reserve when called into service by the President. And unlike constitutional state militias, Congress can deploy state National Guard units overseas. Constitutional state militias are a domestic force only, whereas the National Guard can be used for both domestic and foreign military purposes. Now, of course, if we return to having constitutional state militias and only fight wars that are constitutionally declared by Congress, the servicemen for a foreign war would be derived from the pool of constitutional state militias. And if you are in a country where every able-bodied person is expected to be armed and trained in their firearms on a regular basis, it would be foolish for any country to invade your country. You can see now why the framers wrote the first half of the Second Amendment the way they did. We just learned about how constitutional state militias were supposed to be a check on federal war powers. Another historical check on federal war powers was how we financed the federal government prior to 1913. Whenever Congress declared war, the federal government relied on the states for funding. At least that was the case until 1913. As we've previously discussed, 1913 was a detrimental year for our constitutional republic. In that year, both the 16th and 17th Amendments were added to the Constitution, ushering in the progressive income tax and the direct election of U.S. senators, respectively. These amendments eviscerated checks and balances on the federal government, including on federal war-making powers. The 17th Amendment, in particular, significantly diminished the state's influence over the federal government. Consequently, war profiteers were empowered. And after World War II ended, the United States has increasingly participated in foreign wars, none of which have been formally declared by Congress. But prior to the ratification of those amendments, the federal government could not directly tax individual Americans within each state. Instead, each state would receive a bill from the federal government for the war, and if the state agreed with the war, it would raise money from its citizens. The main sources of federal revenue prior to 1913 were tariffs on foreign nations and excise taxes on imported goods, both of which were set by Congress. The 16th Amendment eliminated the need for tariffs and excise taxes to fund wars. Now the federal government can directly tax you to support an undeclared war, even if you disagree with the war. It would behoove us to return to the wisdom of the framers of the Constitution and repeal both the 16th and 17th Amendments. It would also be prudent to phase out the National Guard and return to having constitutional state militias as the founders intended. And this concludes our class on constitutional state militias. In our next class, we'll cover the history of our enemies, delving into the origins of the conspiracy. We hope to see you there. Thank you for watching, and God bless.